Well, back from Florida, having traveled the last 1,000 miles in about 16 hours. And as you can see, I'm back in my office, back home again. And what I want to do is do a compilation of all of the videos that I've done, do an overview of them into one video. It's going to take a lot longer to do that, obviously, concerning the Qira'at and the Ahruf, specifically that problem. I can see by a lot of the comments that so many people are still confused. And they're confusing, I think, the Qira'at with the manuscripts that we're going to be getting into later. That's true. That's the 7th century manuscripts. But before I do that, before I upload that, I want to talk about something else that has, I think that an awful lot of people have been confused by, and that is the really presupposition you start with when you talk about historical critique, especially Islamic historical critique. I see this in the comments. I see this also in people that are emailing me and also are texting me, and it's this difficulty of separating the narrative that Islam has always given us. And the narrative that Islam has always given us really has only been one, and that is that in the 7th century, a book called the Quran was revealed through the angel Gabriel from these eternal tablets that are in heaven to Muhammad between 610 and 632 when he died. And that from that time on then, as we're going to see, there were many different derivations of it. There were many different what they call Qira'ats or Ahruf. These are dialects. These are many different recitations, as Shabirari likes to call them. And that by the time it was finally created for that final Quran, that canonical Quran at the time of Uthman in 652, that there were now ensconced an entire 7 different dialects, 7 different readings, as they call them. And nobody's looked at this on a timeline, and this is what I'm going to be doing in my next video where I put it all together, and I have been giving you some timelines to help you come along. But the other problem is no one's looking at the timeline concerning everything we know about how the Quran was put together. We have been talking about how the Quran put together, and we've always been going to the 9th and 10th century to know what is happening in the 7th century. And this 9th and 10th century, we need to look at that more carefully. We need to put it on a time. So I'm going to put a timeline right up here. Now take a look at the timeline. Here you can see where Muhammad died, 632. You've seen this before. This is nothing new. You can see when Uthman canonized that final Quran, and you can see that that's roughly 20 years after Muhammad died, so 652. That's when the Qurayshi dialect was put together. And here I'm just going to put up real quickly where the Qira'ats start to appear. That's the 736 is the first one, so we're talking about the 8th century. The 10 Qira'at followed by the 20 narrators, or the transmitters, or the Darawis. These all come from the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, canonized by Ibn Mujahid in the 10th century, 936, and finally by Al-Jazari in 1429. That's the 15th century. That you've always seen, and that's already, we've been unpacking that, and I'll be going through that more when I put up the entire video. But where do we get all this from? Where does all this information come from? Where is it all derived from? Now, you do know, and this is not new to you, and yet most people just don't get this. Everything we know about Muhammad, everything we know about Uthman, everything we know about these Qira'ats that appear, these 10 Qira'ats, the 7 and the 3 makes 10, and even the 20 that come after that, everything we know about how that Quran was put together, how the Musafs were sent by Uthman to 5 different cities, Mecca, Medina, Basra, Kufa, and Damascus. All of that comes from Al-Bukhari, and it comes from Sahih Muslim, and it comes from Ibn Dawud. It comes from the Hadith. Some of it is found in the earlier biography in the Sirat of Muhammad, written by Ibn Hisham, which he derived from Ibn Ishaq, and Ibn Hisham is 833. Al-Bukhari is 870. Let's put those on a timeline, and let's look at this timeline. So let's put the timeline back up again, and let's take a look and see where these guys land. And these guys do not land in the 7th century yet. And here is the same problem again. All that we've known and everything that everybody's arguing about, anything that Yasser Qadi is referring to, anything that Shabir Ali is referring to, all of this reference to these things that are happening in the 7th century, including the Qira'at, including the Ahruf, but also the Musafs and all of the manuscripts, only come to us from the 9th and 10th century. Do you see Al-Bukhari there? Look at that gap. We're talking about 238 years between Al-Bukhari and Muhammad, 632. That's almost, let's just say 240 years to round it off. 240 years. And whenever I hear the stories, they only come from that period, 240 years later. 240 years later. So when you come to the table and you start to look at these manuscripts and you start to look at these different Qira'at, as we're going to introduce, and you start looking at all of them, really what you're looking at is attributions of what was happening then. Attributions written by Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, 240 and more years later. None of that was written during the century Muhammad lived, or during the lifetime Muhammad lived, or during the time of Uthman. It was written hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. How many times have I said that? I don't know. So when you come to Islam and the emergence of Islam, when you come to how Islam began and how the Quran was put together, you start from two completely different suppositions. Most everybody has start from the supposition that the traditions are correct, that everything there is correct. And most of you who are listening to me assume that is correct. But I don't start from that supposition. I think it's pretty clear to me that these traditions written so late are not correct. We're finding they have not been correct on Mecca. We're finding they have not been correct on the Qibla. We're finding they're not even correct on the geographical locations within the Quran. We're finding they're not correct when it comes down to the coinage and who the earliest caliphs are and whether they were Muslims. In fact, it's not been correct on Muhammad. It's not been correct on Islam or the people called Muslims, this city called Mecca, and the book called the Quran. In almost every category, these 5 major categories, it's been incorrect. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed that? And you notice since January, I've been asking this question. This is not something new. So, depending on which supposition you start with, if you start from this presupposition that the traditions are correct, then you're going to read into everything from those traditions. And that's why it was fascinating to me to come across a lot of these numismatists who are scholars or experts in numismatics, which is this study of coins, who were trying to look at these coins that were in 630 and 640 and 661 and 680 up to 692, and they were looking at these coins and they're right there, they're pristine, they don't disintegrate, they don't deteriorate, and they were trying to find how they could make sense of these coins based on what the traditions were telling them. Because the traditions were telling them that these people that were minting these coins, these caliphs, these kings, these rulers of Islam, were Muslims who would have been the first to refer to Muhammad and refer to the Quran and referring to lots of references from the Quran. That they had taken over land all the way, by the time that Muawiyah comes to power, all the way from Tripoli in the west, all the way to Afghanistan in the east. All that land was theirs. Fascinating. That's what the traditions tell us. Yet the coins don't. The coins tell us a completely different story, that in the western part they were still Christian, in the eastern part they were still Zoroastrian, that people like Muawiyah was still a Zoroastrian. There was nothing Islamic about him. Up until 680, there was still nothing Islamic about them. We can't find anything on the coins. The mosques are all facing the wrong way. They're facing much further north. They're facing way up in Petra, in Jordan today, not in Mecca. We can't find any reference to Mecca on any documentation. We can't find it on any map. This great city called Mecca, where everything took place, where Muhammad lived from 570 up until 622, according to the traditions, again, over here. Can you then understand why I no longer trust those traditions? I no longer trust them because they're just too far away from the events. And as a historian, you always go to that which is earliest, that which is either original or closest to the original. So that's what I wanted you to see before we get into the whole Kiraat story, before we go and unpack it so it's all in one place. Before I do that, I really wanted to bring this to you to show you that this is indeed troubling, and no matter what whatever discussion we're going to have, if you start from the traditional account, way over here in the 9th and 10th century, you're going to have a completely different narrative than if you start, as a historian should be doing, from the 7th century and looking and seeing what the 7th century divulges, what it shows us, what we can find there. Completely two different stories. And depending on what supposition, what presupposition you start with, you're going to come to two different answers. Be aware of that. As we get into the whole Qira'at and the Ahruf, as we then move into the manuscript and the Musafs, and the Razm, the skeletal text, always remind yourself, and if you don't do it, I will remind you, that disband everything that we know about the traditions, completely push them back. Don't keep letting them intrude upon your narrative, and come back to the 7th and 8th century, the 7th and early 8th century. Because that's the material, that's the area, that's the era that we need to investigate, because that's when Islam really began. And it looks like it did not begin with any man named Muhammad. It looks like it did not begin in any place called Mecca. It looks like it did not begin with any people called Muslims or a religion called Islam. And it did not begin with a book called the Quran. And that's why, as we move into this, let's make sure that we start with the right supposition, the right narrative, the historical narrative. Only looking at those artifacts, those things, those implements, and inscriptions and documents, and also buildings, coins as well, that come from that era, that tell us the story of actually what was going on. I'll keep reminding you this. I'll put up the timeline so you can see it, so you can visually see where I'm going with this, okay? Well, without any further ado, the next video I put up will be just that, the whole historical overview of how the Qira'at and Ahruf, how I believe the Qira'at and Ahruf were created, what they tell us, and how damaging these are concerning the preservation of the Quran. Okay then, this is Jay. Over and out.